Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna. Legends of giant humans are a staple of folklore and mythology. Most cultures in Earth's history have stories about giants, and Kaimere is much the same. While not all aspects of giant folklore are true, the hinterlands beyond the known world are teeming with all sorts of oversized beings. Some, like Homo altus, have an entirely natural history. This is the most abundant hominid species descended from Homo erectus within the known world. Their women stand nearly 7 feet tall, while men are just over 8 feet on average. Compared to a human, their limbs are proportionally long, making for a very efficient stride. Their trade language name is usually translated as hinterland or common giant, speaking to their abundance beyond more heavily settled areas. The Tlaten of Kaishel and Highlanders of Picardia are also descended from Homo erectus and called giants by many assembly treatises due to their height notably exceeding average humans. There are, however, other sorts of giants that do not have natural origins. The assembly calls these ogres. The first children are an extinct civilization of diminutive humans who have excessive domestication of Kaimere's magic and used it to famously create homunculi. Of these, supernatural giants are among the most famous. Some appear to have been made for war, others for labor, though spectacle may have been just as much of a factor. The ubiquity of giants in our own culture almost certainly was present in the folklore of the first children themselves. While there is an indication ascribed to utilitarian lens as to why homunculi were made, the reality could be as simple as they wanted to recreate the giants of their own legends. Like many of their creations, it appears a genetic base of Homo altus was used for ogres. Homeobac's genes of titanosaurs were used to grow massive yet lightweight bones and air sacs throughout the chest and bone to reduce weight that otherwise would cripple joints and ligaments. For all their derived traits, they are still genetically human. Their genetic makeup is instructed to take on unconventional morphology, but it's still human bone, muscle, and keratin. This is typical of homunculi. For whatever reason, the first children seem to have found coding human tissues to take on features of other animals to be much easier than making hybrids or anything of that nature. Though many homunculi remained in Qajar after the collapse of the first children 10,000 years ago and establishing the Age of Demons, a few giants left the peninsula and spread not only throughout Arvel, but also to Picardia, some of the southern islands, and Nikar. While they may have been capable of making boats, being so lightly built meant that they could effortlessly float, and hereditary magic allowed them to process saltwater, so boats may not have been necessary in every case of immigration. The first children made an unknown number of giants during their occupation of Qajar. While many were among those who left the peninsula during the Age of Demons, only a few lineages seem to have modern descendants. While these lineages have a variety of deviant features at creation, being able to sexually reproduce means that many of the more diagnostic traits were selected against in favor of a more efficient build. And only insular populations tend to retain the old features. Oftentimes, modern ogres look much more human than their extreme specimens. Arvelith ogres, or forest giants, have obvious inclusion of Hukogor sloths. They still have their titanosaur base, so although they have enormous torsos, they are surprisingly lightweight for their size, with formidable nimbleness to go with it. They are one of the many threats facing Kadrith loggers and miners in the Arvelith mainland. While they can digest almost anything, chimerans have proven a threat despite small size, and ogres won't turn down a free meal once they've wiped out a mining party. A few loggers have had success trading tons of ale for work in the camps, but it is a rare ogre that will maintain that work for long. Like all ogres, they are omnivores that mostly bulk feed on plants, though they are the most predatory of the ogres. They aren't macro predators, instead opportunistically taking whatever is easy game or scavenging opportunity that they come upon. But unfortunately for the peoples who live near them, humans are small and easy game, especially unarmed loggers and miners. Mercenary guards can deter them, but ogres are a lot more intelligent than they look, and also a lot quieter, so sneaking around a guard to disable and carry off a few laborers is a reliable path for these hunters. Though the smallest of common ogres, the power of forest giants cannot be overstated. In terms of raw strength, they are uncontested. There are plenty of records of them laying waste to mercenary bands and cavalry units, especially if they have some sort of shield. Even so, they are vulnerable to Megaraptoran attack, and fireback terror birds have been found preying on them, perhaps mistaking them for a female Hukugor, one of their favorite targets. Perhaps the ogre's most hated rival, however, is the Hukugor itself. These sloths have a very potent sense of smell and are substantially larger than ogres. The posture of ogres resembles a threat stance of a sloth, and the general appearance is incongruous with smelling very human. This uncanny juxtaposition appears to greatly irritate the sloth, and they are well documented to target ogres when trashing a camp. Further south, the lineages of ogre, called hill giants, is primarily comprised of mammoth and paleoloxodon in their deviant anatomical traits. Like elephants, they are surprisingly sure-footed for their size. They tend to live in small family groups. Related women and children tend to remain in generally the same river valley, while men are solitary and travel between groups. Women tend to stand just under 4 meters tall, while men routinely exceed 5, which is very helpful for their nomadic lifestyle. These communicate with mammoths thanks to both producing and receiving infrasonic sounds too deep for humans to hear. Because of this, they are capable liaisons between mammoths and people. They also benefit from infrasonic social network of mammoths, which they use to avoid threats or intercept on behalf of the Proboscideans. They tend to avoid human settlements using infrasonic calls to find each other and converse without chimerans noticing. They have no actual genetics of elephants, so the mammoths and Derduga show no kinship with them, though they do communicate and assist one another all the time. The uncanny effect that ogres have on sloths is not present in these two, perhaps because it's a lot harder to mistake a hill giant for a mammoth, though from the front the mistake is quite common for Arvelith Highlanders, especially in forests. Common, prairie, or Nikari ogres are by a substantial margin the most successful kind of giant. They are descended from stock whose non-human composition is almost entirely comprised of titanosaur mimicking morphology, with some traces of boar and paleoloxodon. The titanosaur base has an extreme pneumaticity, and they are actually able to have relatively human proportions, albeit with much longer legs. Very few prairie ogres retain their derived attributes, instead taking on a relatively human appearance, although their skeletal and organ structure retains a lot of the hollow nature of their original construction, as such traits allow for great size and therefore are naturally selected for. They still have osteoderms just below the skin. They look a lot different from their ancestors, likely owing to such a large and healthy population, whereas hill and forest ogres often look much more derived because of their smaller populations. Some prairie ogres, especially older men, do have external osteoderms and long claws, but younger individuals tend not to. As these more armored men tend to be favored by ogre women looking for a lover, the trait is selected for. But it has become more sexual selection rather than protective, and it's hardly enough to save them from an uktan. Mostly they just serve as mineral stores to help them endure hard times and keep growing as they age. Like Highland giants, common ogres are much more social than Shu and other peoples who encounter them tend to believe. They seem stoic, but their language is primarily infrasonic, so we only hear a fraction of what they're saying. They may only travel in small family groups, but it is typical for them to keep in touch with other bands within a few miles, and they congregate every few days to converse and trade. Shu believe they instinctively or even magically find themselves through these meetings, but often the ogres have been planning a meet for miles before they assemble, and gatherings are anything but arbitrary. Common ogres range throughout the forest, prairies, and deserts of Nikar, and all along the grasslands of northern Kairul. Like the tantanosaurs they are so derived from, the complex air sacs makes their respiration so efficient, and size at all possible by some severe limitations of their cold tolerance. Any climate colder than subtropical can lead to congestion and even respiratory infection. Though generally animals are larger in colder climates, the very system which allow prairie giants to attain such extremes beyond their forest and hill-dwelling kin excludes them from regions that might benefit from heat-conserving bulk. As it is, they are amazing at shedding heat and even metabolizing sun in their skin, but they cannot venture too high into tropical mountains for fear of sickness. Although most giants subsist on local flora, one lineage is far more predatory: the trolls. There are two kinds: greater and lesser trolls. They dwell in dense forests and wetlands, feeding on anything they come across, be it vegetation or creature. Similar to ogres, the greater trolls possess extreme pneumaticity and are much more common in Nikar and northern Arvel, whereas the lesser ogres of Picardia, the southern islands, and temperate Arvel are much smaller and are far less derived in their air sacs. Trolls are extremely reclusive. They may hunt people, but sneaking into a village, gathering prey with quickly impaling strikes, then disappearing all without making a sound, makes them hard to keep track of. Even their footprints are fairly nondescript, easily mistaken for those of proboscideans or even sauropods. Some think that they may have a clonal lineage with only females in existence. Though this theory has not been verified by the Assembly, it would explain how such a small population can persist, much like the harpies. Though it could well be that there are far more trolls than are documented. The most elusive supernatural giants are the Welkentra. Derived from the Old English for walking tree and applying to any number of accounts throughout the known world, these have been discussed in Assembly literature for centuries. It was long assumed to be exclusive to folklore, then assumed to possibly be a cryptid, though several specimens have been encountered by Assembly scholars. There are many types, all blending in with local trees. Bracardient Welkentra tend to resemble juniper and pines, those in southern Arvel blend in with oak and mountain ash, while those in northern Arvel and Nikar might look like teakwood, mahogany, ginkgos, palms, or cypress. This assimilation with local trees around them has led some to suggest that they might be natural magic, not homunculi created by the first children. As an origin with the first children, would be more sensible if they resembled trees from the peninsula. Then again, perhaps they simply walked to climates in which they were more comfortable. Many skin changers resemble local fauna, so it makes sense if Welkentra began as skin changers and then take the form of flora around them. Tests of specimens taken by the assembly from Welkentraw killed by a titanosaur show that not only do they have skeletal structures, bark and leaf samples taken from the specimen were not only comprised of human tissue, they were specifically made of keratin. Treatises from the Great Library cover a wide range of theories of Welkentraw origin, though generally they consider them to be homunculi. An undisclosed artifact appears to convince these scholars that Welkentraw are specifically Class 1 homunculi, meant to be made as an attempt to make their organisms photosynthetic. If this were the case, the experiment was successful, as many Class 2 and all Class 3 homunculi can use the sun as a metabolic substitute. These highly advanced homunculi must still eat, as photosynthesis falls far short of digestion in terms of efficiency, but is beneficial especially when paired with the stasis adapted from heterotherms. This photosynthetic skin in later homunculi does appear to have started with an experimental creation of Welkentraw, or similar creatures. Welkentraw do not need to eat, and indeed seem to get by on their own just through photosynthesis. However, when they regularly move, they do need to eat and digest, usually doing so with whatever tree they resemble. This may in fact be how they adapted to local flora, effectively becoming what they ate. Though ogres and other supernatural giants tend to avoid settled areas, they are well established and iconic residents of the known world and beyond. Their origin was almost certainly a celebration of the thrill we feel when encountering something larger than convention, and wonder is a foundational element of their role in Chimeran folklore as well. Though the few Chimerans who have been trusted with their own songs and stories, which show a diversity of cultures and impressions of Chimerans as a whole, these enormous beings seem content to be left alone. Thank you so much to Ian for sponsoring this episode. Ogres and other giants are an important component of the setting, and they've played a role in several stories, yet I've had very little call to speak on them in these videos. It was good to better establish their lore. Next week we will meet the Harpies, another icon of Kaimere with a few points of view stories, one of which was in my first anthology. Thank you so much to my Patreon patrons for your support of this project. Your contribution is how I'm able to devote so much time to the project, as I have without needing to return to a day job, and your support is deeply appreciated. I also couldn't do this without sponsors like Ian, so thank you very much for that. Last but not least, cheers to you for watching. Every little bit helps. Stay fantastic, everyone. Cheers, folks!